Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who are being protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that though perishable is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Whoever composed the first letter of Peter knew a thing or two of real suffering and the power of real joy. This year, I have been reminded more than ever before of the daily, even hourly challenge of continuing to move towards joy. We live in a hurting world, but not that it's any surprise to any of you, especially as you watch me through your computer screens and not gathered together in the sanctuary at Church of the Ascension as we had hoped. These past 2 years, as we have wrestled with the impacts of coronavirus and social isolation, faced the deep realities of our systemic racism, and said goodbye to many of the elements of life we once took for granted, there have been perhaps daily moments where the idea of joy feels far away. You're probably thinking, wow, a bit of a downer introduction you have there. And you would be absolutely right. Because acknowledging our shortcomings, the challenges beyond our control, is never an easy conversation. At any given moment, we may grieve the ways in which we have failed. We may grieve for lost loved ones and deep injustices and people we have hurt. To be human is to have experienced this feeling. After all, Jesus himself, in the shortest and perhaps most poignant verse of the Bible, wept. Jesus suffered as we all do, grieved as we all do. And yet, Jesus also experienced great joy, encouraged laughter. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled, he says in Luke chapter 6. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Jesus does not try to deny one's feelings of grief in this passage, but rather acknowledges them as a foundation for great joy. Jesus, in all of his humanness, recognized that human life was filled with suffering, and yet equally filled with tremendous gladness. To be human is to exist in a liminal space, a space between joy and suffering, a space that acknowledges the reality and existence of both. In many ways, all living things reflect and reveal an inherent sacred pattern of suffering and joy woven into all creation. One person I like to imagine wrestling with holding suffering in one hand and joy in the other hand, and eventually, realizing the truth that even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials, the faithful can equally rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. The disciple and apostle Peter. Now, I do understand that more than likely the simple fisherman turned apostle probably didn't write the letters we now have in the Bible. But I wonder if the example of Peter's life is what we hear in those later epistles. Peter had long been faithful. He dropped his nets to follow Jesus, traveling alongside him for several years, witnessing miracles and healing and grace. He was the first to call Jesus Messiah. His faith so solid that his name Peter, or Petros, as originally written, quite literally translates to rock, a symbol of his place as a cornerstone, a foundation of the church. And yet, Peter was also undeniably, unmistakably human. He was irritable and rash, with an ego big enough to count for all 12 disciples, and then some. He was constantly indecisive, his hesitancy a challenge for those who relied on him. Lest we not forget, it was Peter who denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times, and then proceeded to stand in the shadows as his friend was tortured and killed. And upon witnessing this, Peter, human through and through, went out and wept bitterly. Peter grieved a lost loved one, grieved for the deep injustice, grieved for the friend he had hurt. Jesus knew Peter would deny him. He knew Peter had an ego, that he asked questions at the wrong times, that he had a tendency to mess things up. And yet, Jesus chose Peter to help lead the early church, not because he was perfect, but rather precisely because he was imperfect. When Jesus appeared to Peter by the Sea of Galilee after his resurrection, he forgave Peter 3 times, 1 for each denial. And through grace, Peter, human, flawed, was reborn with tremendous joy. This joy of forgiveness was what gave Peter the strength to lead the early community of faith, what gave him a living hope. This moment of forgiveness did not act as an eraser for all future suffering Peter would endure, but rather as a reminder to continue moving towards joy. The opening words from the epistle of 1 Peter, as well as the story of Peter himself, constantly remind me to hold space for the suffering. While the theologian in me is quick to want to reframe discomfort to make sense of it all, Peter's story reminds me that grief, joy, and everything in between are never linear. While we remain to exist on this earth, we will continue to experience moments of great joy, followed by moments of great suffering. We will rejoice in the birth of new children, but grieve the loss of aging family, celebrate great successes, and mourn inevitable failures. We will touch the rawest, realest moments of life, and we will realize within all of them that joy remains. Peter's moment of rebirth on the beach mirrors that of a child and reminds us that joy and suffering are, in many instances, simultaneously present. We celebrate new life, but must wait anxiously, perhaps even warily, for the child to arrive. The mother's body bends and shifts, aches and stretches, but also experiences moments of miraculous awe and disbelief. Finally, the child is born in a whirlwind of pain and suffering, weeping and lamenting, as Peter did on the night of Jesus' death. Then, from within the lament, a child arrives. Peter is forgiven. Great joy and celebration surround us. Grief has not been eradicated, but rather adds a layer of nuance to our most joyous moments that allows us to touch the most authentic parts of our humanity. Jesus saw this nuance in Peter, not a perfect human, but a forgiven human, a man who acknowledged pain and continued to move through it towards joy, a man who could help lead others to do the same. As we near the conclusion of 2021 and anticipate 2022, I recognize that just over 100 years ago, as the Diocese of Western North Carolina was preparing to be officially recognized as an independent diocese, the community of faith in our area was emerging from the ravages of the Spanish flu pandemic. In our DNA is the spiritual muscle memory of moving through challenging times, of walking through the valley of suffering and death, of honoring the grief, and then always seeing and celebrating the joy. For me, joy is not the absence of sadness and grief, but rather, joy is the deep gladness born out of deep peace. Joy is fundamentally connected to the assurance that we are not alone in our suffering, but surrounded by the steadfast presence of God's love. Knowing and believing in this truth, we are then empowered to be profoundly present in the moment, acknowledging the grief, but not wallowing in the pain. Joy is what moves us to not only see our lives in the full story of God, but also to see the simplicity in the small things right in front of us. Joy honors the suffering and grief by compelling us to live and serve others with purpose and intentionality. Joy equips us to not only delight in the beauty of creation, but also to risk for the sake of Christ, to sacrifice for a broken world desperate for a word of healing, love, and hope. Joy is what inspires us to use our personal and collective gifts to do the work of Jesus, to be the embodiment of holy love. And so, as we move forward, may we hold space for grief, but also for celebration. May we acknowledge our liminal space, the hyphen between challenge and gladness. And may we continue to move towards joy, knowing we too are forgiven.